Hello and welcome. You find yourself standing at the threshold of a tale that spans millennia, a story woven through the fabric of reality itself, where mortal ambition transcends the very boundaries of life and death. This is the Chronicle of Vecna, a name whispered in fear across countless worlds, a being who rose from the lowest depths of society to challenge the gods themselves. His journey is not merely one of power acquired, but of vengeance pursued, knowledge coveted, and mortality defied through means so dark that they would forever alter the nature of magic and undeath in every realm he touched. Long before the great empires rose and fell, before the wars that would reshape continents, there existed a city called Fleeth on the world of Oerth. This was a place of the Flan people, specifically the Urflan, humans renowned throughout the ages for their exceptional mastery of arcane arts. Yet, for all their magical prowess, Fleeth was a city bound by rigid social hierarchies, where both determined destiny and the untouchable caste lived in the shadows of society, denied even the basic dignities afforded to common citizens. Within this lowest stratum of humanity, among those deemed unworthy by their fellows, a child was born who would one day make the world itself tremble at the mention of his name. The boy who would become Vecna entered the world as a member of this untouchable caste, his very existence a mark of shame in the eyes of Fleeth's ruling powers. His mother, a woman named Mazel, possessed a gift that both blessed and cursed their family. She was a hedge witch, a practitioner of magic who had learned her craft outside the approved channels of the city's established order. In those early years, when Vecna was still innocent of the darkness that would consume him, Mazel became his first teacher, gently guiding his young mind through the fundamental principles of arcane manipulation. She showed him how to sense the invisible currents of magical energy that flowed through all things, how to shape them with will and word, how to command forces that others could not even perceive. But the city of Fleeth worshipped Foltest, the god of light, law, and uncompromising order. The clerics and authorities who served this deity viewed magic, particularly the arcane sorcery practiced outside their control, with deep suspicion and hostility. To them, such practices represented chaos, a challenge to the established order, a dangerous force that threatened the stability they had worked so hard to maintain. Mazel's crime was not merely that she practiced magic, but that she did so without sanction, without permission, without bowing to those who claimed authority over such matters. When the government of Fleeth discovered her activities, they showed no mercy to a woman of the untouchable caste who dared to wield powers beyond her station. The execution of Mazel stands as the pivotal moment that set Vecna upon his dark path. The government officials of Fleeth, acting in the name of law and order, took the young boy's mother from him and ended her life for the crime of practicing witchcraft. They severed the one meaningful connection Vecna had to another living soul, the one person who had seen value in a child born to the untouchable caste, the only teacher who who had nurtured his burgeoning magical talents. In that moment, as he witnessed or learned of his mother's death at the hands of those who claimed moral authority, something fundamental shifted within the young Vecna. The grief, the rage, the absolute powerlessness he felt in that moment became the seed from which an eternal hatred would grow. Vecna swore revenge. This was not the hot, impulsive anger of youth that fades with time and distance. This was something colder, deeper, more patient, and infinitely more dangerous. He vowed that every single person responsible for his mother's execution would pay for what they had done, that the city of Fleeth itself would one day know the cost of its cruelty, that the established order which had crushed his mother would be torn down and trampled beneath his feet. But Vecna understood, even in his youth, that revenge is a dish best served by those who possess the power to enforce their will upon the world. He could not strike back immediately, could not challenge the might of Fleeth's government and priesthood with the limited knowledge Mazel had managed to impart before her death. So Vecna disappeared. He vanished from Fleeth, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, stepping into a wider world that cared nothing for the grievances of one untouchable child. What transpired during those missing years remains shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. The truth obscured by the passage of countless centuries and the deliberate obfuscation of one who would become the master of secrets himself. But when Vecna eventually emerged from his self-imposed exile, he had been transformed. The boy who had fled Fleeth returned as something far more dangerous, having achieved a mastery of the dark arts that no mortal before him had ever accomplished, and as many claim, that no mortal since has ever matched. The source of this extraordinary transformation has been debated by scholars and sages for generations. One persistent legend speaks of Moxlick the serpent, a mysterious entity believed by some to be the living personification of arcane magic itself. According to this account, it was this serpentine being who took Vecna under its tutelage during those lost years, who revealed to the young exile the deepest secrets of magical theory and practice, who showed him paths to power that others had never imagined. The serpent, if the tales are true, did not merely teach Vecna spells and rituals, but fundamentally altered his understanding of what magic could accomplish, opening his mind to possibilities that conventional wizardry had never dared to explore. Yet, other sources present a different narrative, one in which Vecna's education took an even darker turn. Some texts suggest that it was not the serpent who became his patron, but rather Orcus, the demon prince of undeath himself. This version of events claims that Orcus recognized something in the young, bitter exile from Fleeth, some quality of hatred and ambition that made him the perfect student for the most forbidden knowledge of all. In this telling, it was Orcus who revealed to Vecna the secrets of lichdom, who showed him the ritual that would allow a mortal wizard to transcend death entirely, transforming into an undead being of terrible power, while retaining all the knowledge and personality they possessed in life. More recent accounts documented in the writings of the 5th edition of the Great Chronicles, present yet another possibility. These texts describe Vecna's mother not merely as executed, but as exiled by an order of elder wizards who accused her of practicing forbidden necromancy. In this version, the young Vecna was not free to disappear, but was instead bound into servitude by this same order, forced to labor for the very people who had destroyed his family. According to this narrative, a voice began to speak to him during his captivity, whispering dark promises and terrible knowledge, guiding him toward greater and greater magical ability. When his skills had developed sufficiently, Vecna turned on his captors and massacred the entire order of elder wizards, taking his revenge far earlier in life than other accounts suggest. The voice then commanded him to begin his greatest work, to start scribing the Book of Vile Darkness, a tome that would become one of the most notorious artifacts of evil ever created. Regardless of which account holds the greater truth, certain facts remain consistent across all tellings. Vecna emerged from his years of study and preparation with magical abilities that exceeded anything his contemporaries could achieve. He had delved into branches of arcane knowledge that others feared to even acknowledge, had mastered techniques and rituals that conventional wizards deemed too dangerous or too corrupt to pursue. More significantly, he had discovered or been taught the secret of lichdom, the profoundly vile ritual that would allow him to conquer death itself. The ritual of lichdom is not merely a spell or incantation, but a fundamental transformation of the wizard's very essence. It requires the practitioner to willingly embrace undeath, to tear their own soul from their living body, and imprison it within a specially prepared vessel called a phylactery. This phylactery becomes the true anchor of the lich's existence, the receptacle that holds their life force and allows them to persist even when their physical form is destroyed. The ritual itself demands acts of profound evil, sacrifices and transgressions that irrevocably stain the caster's soul, ensuring that only those willing to abandon any pretense of morality can complete the transformation. Vecna performed this ritual, becoming the first true lich, or at the very least, one of the earliest practitioners of this dark art. His physical body began the slow process of decay that characterizes all liches, his flesh withering, his appearance becoming increasingly skeletal and corpse-like as the years progressed. But in exchange for this physical deterioration, he gained something far more valuable than mere appearance. He became immortal, immune to the passage of time, freed from the natural cycle of life and death that constrains all mortal beings. His magical power, no longer limited by the finite lifespan of a human wizard, could continue to grow indefinitely, accumulating knowledge and ability across centuries that would become millennia. With immortality secured and his magical mastery continuing to expand, Vecna turned his attention back to the oath he had sworn over his mother's grave. The city of Fleeth still stood. Its government still ruled in the name of Foltest, its people still lived their lives in the rigid social hierarchies that had condemned Mazel to death. Nearly 1,000 years had passed since Vecna's birth, a span of time that had seen generations rise and fall, entire civilizations transform, and the world itself change in countless ways. But Vecna had not forgotten. His hatred had not diminished with the centuries, had not been diluted by time or distance. If anything, it had crystallized into something pure and terrible, refined across ages of patient waiting into an instrument of absolute destruction. When Vecna finally returned to Fleeth, he came not as the powerless child of the untouchable caste, but as a lich of incomprehensible might, commanding an army that reflected the dark path he had walked. He had gathered to his banner legions of the undead, corpses and skeletons animated by necromantic power, spectral entities bound to his will, and worse things still, creatures of nightmare given form through forbidden rituals. Alongside these unliving servants marched an army of arcane spellcasters, wizards and sorcerers who had either been seduced by Vecna's promises of power or coerced through darker means into his service. Together, this unholy host laid siege to the city of Fleeth, surrounding it, cutting it off from aid or escape, preparing to deliver the vengeance that had waited nearly a millennium for its fulfillment. The siege that followed tested even Vecna's formidable abilities. The clerics of Foltest, those servants of light and law who had executed Mazel so long ago, recognized the threat that the lich represented. They channeled the divine power of their god, calling down holy radiance that seared undead flesh and disrupted necromantic magic. Wielding the very antithesis of everything Vecna had become, legend speaks of how these clerics nearly succeeded in destroying Vecna during his first assault on the city. How their faith and divine connection brought the ancient lich to the brink of true death, forcing him to retreat and reassess his approach. But Vecna had not survived for nearly 1,000 years by being reckless or easily deterred. He withdrew from Fleeth, regrouped his forces, refined his strategies, and prepared for a second assault. When he returned, he had devised methods to counter the divine magic of Foltest's priests, had prepared spells and tactics specifically designed to neutralize their holy powers. This time, there would be no retreat, no mercy, no possibility of failure. The second siege of Fleeth ended not with the city's brave resistance, but with its utter annihilation. Vecna's forces breached the walls, overwhelmed the defenders, and poured into the streets like a dark tide. The lich's magic and his undead servants cut through civilian and soldier alike, showing no distinction between the guilty and the innocent, between those who had participated in Mazel's execution and those who had not yet been born when she died. Vecna's revenge had transcended individual culpability, had expanded to encompass the entire city that had dared to wrong him. When the slaughter finally ended, Vecna commanded that every head be severed from every corpse. These gruesome trophies were then stacked in great piles before the government officials who had somehow survived the massacre. With the heads of their own family members placed prominently at the top of each mound, it was a display calculated not merely to horrify, but to break the spirits of those who witnessed it, to ensure that they understood the totality of their defeat. Having demonstrated the absolute futility of resistance, having shown that 1,000 years had not dimmed his memory or his wrath, Vecna then performed an act that was perhaps more terrible than the slaughter itself. He granted them mercy. The surviving officials were given leave to depart Fleeth, to walk away from the ruins of their city and the bodies of everyone they had ever known. Vecna even promised them his protection for the remainder of their natural lives, ensuring that they would not fall victim to bandits or misfortune during their exile. This was not kindness, but the cruelest possible punishment. These officials would live out their remaining years, knowing that they had witnessed the destruction of everything they had sworn to protect, that they had survived only because the architect of that destruction wanted them to carry the memory of their failure, that they owed their continued existence to the whim of the very monster they had helped create through their persecution of a hedge witch so many centuries before. The fall of Fleeth marked not an ending, but a beginning. Vecna's vengeance was complete, but his ambitions had grown far beyond the settling of old scores. He had tasted absolute power, had seen entire cities fall before his might, had proven that even the servants of the gods themselves could not stand against him. Why should such a being content himself with mere revenge, when far greater prizes lay within reach? The world of Oerth stretched vast and unconquered before him, filled with kingdoms and empires that did not yet know his name, with secrets and knowledge waiting to be claimed, with possibilities that even his millennium of existence had not yet explored. And so, from the ashes of Fleeth, from the fulfillment of an oath sworn by a grieving child and kept by an immortal lich, an empire would begin to rise. Vecna would not stop with one destroyed city. He would build something that would make the world tremble, that would challenge the very foundations of divine and mortal power, that would prove once and for all that a boy born into the untouchable caste could rise higher than any king, any emperor, any being that had ever drawn breath. The tale of Vecna's origin, of his transformation from victim to villain, from mortal to lich, was complete. Now the true story of his reign would begin. Section 2. The Rise of an Empire. From the smoking ruins of Fleeth, Vecna turned his gaze outward across the Sheldummer Valley and the surrounding lands of Oerth. The destruction of a single city, no matter how personally satisfying, was merely the opening movement of a far grander symphony of conquest. For centuries, he had accumulated knowledge, refined his magical abilities, and pondered the true nature of power. Now, as an immortal lich freed from the constraints of mortal lifespan, he possessed both the time and the capability to pursue ambitions that would have been impossible for any ordinary wizard, no matter how talented. The Sheldummer Valley became the foundation upon which Vecna would build his empire. This fertile region, home to numerous settlements and kingdoms, presented both opportunity and challenge to the aspiring conqueror. The lands were populated by various peoples, governed by different rulers, protected by armies both mundane and magical. Yet none of them could have anticipated the nature of the threat that now moved against them. They were accustomed to wars between mortal kings, to conflicts that ended with treaties, or the death of a single monarch. They had no framework for understanding a foe who could not die, who commanded legions that felt no fear or pain, whose patience was measured in centuries rather than seasons. Vecna's campaign of conquest was not the hasty rampage of a mindless destroyer, but rather a methodical, calculated expansion orchestrated by one of the most brilliant tactical minds ever to exist. He did not simply march his undead armies against city walls and overwhelm defenders through brute force. Though he was certainly capable of such direct assaults when the situation warranted, instead he employed a far more insidious approach, one that leveraged his greatest strengths as both a wizard and an immortal being. He studied each target carefully, learning their strengths and weaknesses, their political structures and social divisions, the personalities of their leaders, and the morale of their people. Where possible, Vecna preferred to corrupt rather than destroy. He would send agents into cities and kingdoms years before his armies arrived, establishing networks of spies and cultists who worked to undermine the existing order from within. These operatives spread rumors, fostered distrust among allied nations, bribed officials, and gradually prepared their homelands for eventual conquest. By the time Vecna's forces actually appeared on the horizon, resistance had often already crumbled from internal decay, with key defenders either dead, compromised, or demoralized. The wizard also made extensive use of necromancy, not merely as a tool of war, but as a psychological weapon of tremendous potency. When his armies did lay siege to a settlement, he would raise the slain defenders as undead servants and send them back against their former comrades and loved ones. The horror of fighting against reanimated friends and family members shattered the morale of defenders far more effectively than any conventional siege weapon. Survivors who witnessed their fallen companions rise to serve the enemy often lost the will to continue fighting, knowing that even death would not spare them from serving Vecna's purposes. As village after village, town after town, and eventually kingdom after kingdom fell to Vecna's expanding dominion, his power grew exponentially. Each conquest brought him new subjects to exploit, new resources to fuel his war machine, and most importantly, new corpses to swell the ranks of his undead legions. The armies that served him became truly unfathomable in number, a tide of animated dead so vast that contemporary accounts struggled to describe their magnitude. Entire battlefields would vanish beneath the march of skeleton warriors, zombies, wights, and worse creatures still, all bound to Vecna's inexorable will. But Vecna's empire was more than just military might and necromantic horror. The lich possessed an insatiable hunger for knowledge that matched and perhaps exceeded even his lust for power. As his territories expanded, he established centers of magical research and experimentation throughout his domain. These facilities served multiple purposes, functioning as schools where wizards loyal to Vecna could study and advance their craft, as laboratories where forbidden experiments could be conducted without interference from squeamish authorities, and as repositories where the arcane knowledge gathered from conquered lands could be cataloged and preserved. It was during this period of imperial expansion that Vecna conducted the dark experiments that would cement his reputation as one of the most brilliant and terrifying magical innovators in history. Even before achieving lichdom, he had conquered villages specifically to use their populations as subjects for necromantic research. Now, with an entire empire at his disposal, he could pursue these investigations on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of experiments failed, producing nothing but corpses and wasted effort. But Vecna persisted, driven by an obsession with perfecting the process of transformation from life to undeath. His breakthrough came in the development of what would become known as the lich transformation ritual, a perfected version of the process that had granted him immortality. This ritual represented the culmination of decades, or perhaps centuries of research, a magical working of such complexity and power that it could reliably transform a living wizard into an undead lich. The process siphoned energy from the very planes of existence themselves, channeling these vast forces to animate a lifeless body with immortal consciousness, while preserving the wizard's full magical abilities and accumulated knowledge. The creation of this ritual had consequences that extended far beyond Vecna's own ambitions. By perfecting and codifying the process of lichdom, he had opened a door that could never truly be closed again. Other wizards, learning of Vecna's achievement and coveting the same immortality, would seek to follow in his footsteps. Some would succeed, adding to the number of liches that plagued the world. Many more would fail, and in their failure, they would suffer a fate that some scholars believe was deliberately engineered by Vecna as a final curse upon those who dared to imitate him. These failed aspirants to lichdom did not simply die. Instead, they were transformed into creatures called Nothics, twisted aberrations that forgot their former identities and became consumed by an insatiable hunger for secrets and forbidden knowledge. Whether this transformation was an inherent risk of the ritual or a deliberate trap left by Vecna remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some theorists suggest that the Nothics might be attempting to reverse their condition. By gathering the knowledge they need to complete their transformation, while others propose the darker possibility that they are compelled to seek out secrets, specifically to deliver them to Vecna himself, functioning as unwitting spies scattered across the world. As Vecna's empire reached the height of its power and territorial extent, he began to surround himself with a court of powerful individuals who served various functions within his dark regime. Chief among these servants, and by far the most significant, was a warrior of exceptional skill and absolute loyalty named Kaz. The exact circumstances of how Kaz came to serve Vecna vary depending on which historical account you consult, but all versions agree on certain fundamental facts. Kaz was a human of remarkable martial prowess, a warrior whose skill with blade and armor exceeded that of any common soldier. He became Vecna's most trusted lieutenant, the general who commanded the lich's armies in the field, the champion who fought in Vecna's name when personal combat was required. The relationship between Vecna and Kaz represents one of the most complex and ultimately tragic partnerships in the history of the multiverse. On one hand, Kaz served Vecna with unwavering dedication for what must have been centuries. He led the undead legions to victory after victory, expanding the boundaries of Vecna's empire through both strategic brilliance and personal valor. He acted as the public face of Vecna's rule in many respects, the visible commander who interacted with conquered populations and managed the day-to-day military operations that maintained control over the vast territories under their dominion. In recognition of this faithful service, Vecna bestowed upon Kaz a gift of incredible power. The lich created for his champion a sentient sword, a weapon of such devastating magical potency that it would become legendary in its own right. This was not merely an enchanted blade, but a thinking, plotting artifact imbued with intelligence and purpose. The sword enhanced Kaz's already formidable combat abilities to supernatural levels, making him virtually unstoppable in battle. With this weapon in hand, Kaz became more than just a skilled warrior. He became a force of nature, a one-man army capable of turning the tide of entire battles through his intervention. Yet the sword was not the blessing it appeared to be. Whether Vecna intended this from the beginning, or whether the blade developed its own agenda independent of its creator's designs, the weapon began to exert a corrupting influence on Kaz. It whispered to him constantly, feeding his pride, nurturing his ambitions, suggesting that a warrior of his capabilities deserved more than the role of eternal second-in-command. Why should he serve when he could rule? Why should he bow to a withered corpse when he possessed the strength and the weapon to claim power for himself? Day by day, year by year, the sword's insidious whispers eroded Kaz's loyalty, replacing his devotion to Vecna with dreams of usurpation. Another figure who served in Vecna's court during this period would also achieve lasting infamy, though through a different path than Kaz. Asururak was a wizard of considerable talent who studied under Vecna's tutelage, learning the arcane arts in the shadow of the greatest magical mind of the age. The lich permitted Asururak to access the rotted tower, a section of Vecna's keep that housed extensive libraries and research materials. In what might have been Vecna's first, and perhaps only act of gratitude, he allowed Asururak to study the detailed processes of lich transformation that were documented in the tower's upper levels. Asurrak absorbed this knowledge eagerly, but he did not immediately attempt the transformation. Instead, he bided his time, studying and preparing, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. That moment came with the catastrophic events that would soon shake Vecna's empire to its very foundations. According to some sources, Asurrak did more than simply wait for opportunity. He actively orchestrated the circumstances that led to Vecna's near destruction, manipulating events from behind the scenes to engineer his master's downfall. Whether this accusation holds truth or represents later historical revision remains uncertain, but it demonstrates the paranoia and betrayal that characterized the highest levels of Vecna's court. What is known with certainty is that after Vecna's fall, Asurrak departed from the ruins of the empire and traveled to the vast swamp, a desolate region where he could work undisturbed. There he constructed an underground temple that would become infamous across all lands and ages as the Tomb of Horrors. Having studied Vecna's lich transformation ritual, Asurrak successfully performed the process himself, achieving the immortality his former master had attained. But Asurrak's ambitions extended beyond mere lichdom. He secluded himself within his tomb for hundreds of years, conducting further research and experimentation until he achieved an even more advanced state of undeath known as demi-lichdom. In this form, Asurrak became a powerful and feared entity in his own right. His tomb, a legendary death trap that would claim the lives of countless adventurers across the ages. As Vecna's empire reached its zenith, the Lich himself began to contemplate goals that transcended mere territorial conquest. He had built the largest empire the world had yet seen. He commanded armies beyond counting. He possessed magical knowledge that no other living being could match. He had achieved functional immortality through his transformation into lichdom. Yet despite all these accomplishments, Vecna remained fundamentally mortal in nature, albeit an undead mortal who had cheated death through arcane means. The Lich's thoughts turned increasingly toward a loftier ambition, one that had tempted countless powerful beings throughout history, but that few had ever achieved. Vecna began to plan his own ascension to godhood itself. This was not the mad fantasy of a deluded mortal, but a carefully calculated goal pursued by an immortal intellect that had spent centuries studying the nature of divine power. Vecna understood that gods drew their strength from the worship of mortals. That belief itself was a form of power that could sustain and empower divine beings. He recognized that his empire, with its millions of conquered subjects, represented a potential power base of unprecedented scale. The Lich began to devise a ritual of cosmic proportions, a working of magic so vast and terrible that it would leverage the life force of his entire empire to propel him beyond mortality and into true divinity. Every man, woman, and child living under Vecna's rule would serve as fuel for this transformation. their very existence sacrificed to power the ritual that would elevate their ruler to godhood. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty and ambition, one that perfectly encapsulated everything Vecna had become during his long journey from vengeful child to undead emperor. Preparations for this ritual must have taken years or even decades to complete. Vecna would need to gather specific components, inscribe vast ritual circles, position his empire's population in precise configurations, and time the working to coincide with particular astronomical or planar alignments. Throughout all these preparations, he relied heavily on Kaz to maintain order and security, to ensure that no external threats disrupted the delicate process, to handle the mundane details of imperial administration, while Vecna focused on his transcendent goal. But Vecna had made a critical error in judgment, one that would cost him nearly everything he had built. He had failed to recognize the extent to which the sentient sword had corrupted his most trusted servant. He had not perceived that Kaz's loyalty had been transformed into bitter resentment, that his champion no longer saw him as a master to be served, but as an obstacle to be removed. Most critically, Vecna had not anticipated that Kaz would choose the moment of the ritual, the point of Vecna's greatest vulnerability and greatest triumph, as the perfect time to strike. As Vecna stood at the apex of his power, on the very threshold of divinity, with the ritual reaching its climax and cosmic forces beginning to gather around him, Kaz attacked. The champion drew the sentient sword that Vecna himself had created and turned it against its maker. The battle that followed was cataclysmic in scale, a clash between the most powerful lich in existence and a warrior wielding a weapon specifically designed to kill. The combat shook the foundations of Vecna's citadel, unleashing magical and martial forces of such magnitude that they threatened to tear reality itself apart in their immediate vicinity. The interrupted ritual, its carefully balanced energies suddenly thrown into chaos by the violence erupting at its center, began to collapse in on itself. The power that was meant to elevate Vecna to godhood instead ran wild, unleashing destruction on an apocalyptic scale. The empire that had taken centuries to build, the millions of lives that were meant to fuel Vecna's transformation, the carefully constructed apparatus of conquest and control, all of it was obliterated in a magical conflagration that rewrote the geography of entire regions. When the dust finally settled and the magical fires burned themselves out, both Vecna and Kaz had been destroyed, or so it seemed to the few survivors who witnessed the aftermath of that terrible battle. The empire was gone, shattered beyond any hope of recovery. The armies had been dispersed or destroyed. The great works that Vecna had created lay in ruins. It appeared that the lich's ambitions had finally exceeded his grasp, that his pride had engineered his downfall, that the story of Vecna had reached its conclusion in fire and death, and the collapse of all he had built. But those who believed Vecna truly dead did not understand the nature of what he had become. or the depths of hatred and willpower that sustained his existence. The ritual that transforms a wizard into a lich does more than simply grant immortality. It fundamentally alters the relationship between body and soul, anchoring the practitioner's consciousness to their phylactery rather than their physical form. Even when Vecna's body was torn apart by Ka's assault and the collapsing ritual, even when he was scattered and broken and reduced to fragments, his soul persisted. Vecna's hatred, the same burning resentment that had driven him to destroy Fleeth after nearly 1,000 years, would not permit him to simply die. His festering rage at this new betrayal, at seeing his moment of ultimate triumph stolen by the very champion he had trusted and empowered, gave him the strength to endure even when endurance should have been impossible. His soul, too heavy with wickedness and malice to simply dissipate, refused to accept its apparent fate. Against all probability and expectation, Vecna survived. But survival came at a terrible price. His body had been dismembered, scattered across vast distances by the forces unleashed in his battle with Kaz. Most of these fragments were eventually recovered or destroyed in the ages that followed, but 2 pieces of Vecna's form could not be reclaimed. His left hand and his left eye, severed from his body in the combat with Kaz, had survived the cataclysm as independent artifacts of immense power. These remnants would take on lives of their own in the centuries to come, becoming legendary items sought after by the ambitious and the foolish, each bearing a fragment of Vecna's consciousness and power, each serving as a connection to the lich, even in his diminished state. The hand and eye of Vecna would go on to corrupt countless individuals across the ages, granting tremendous power to those who dared to graft these undead body parts onto their own forms, while simultaneously drawing them deeper into Vecna's influence and serving his purposes in ways they rarely understood until it was too late. But the existence of these artifacts and the legends that grew around them served another crucial purpose. They kept Vecna's name alive. They ensured that he was not forgotten, that mortals continued to speak of him with fear and awe, that his story was told and retold across generations. And as his name endured, as stories of his power spread, something remarkable began to occur. Cultists emerged who worshipped Vecna not as a historical figure, but as a dark god worthy of veneration. They prayed to him, offered him sacrifices, built shrines in his name, and performed rituals in his honor. This worship, this belief, this channeling of mortal faith toward Vecna's shattered soul began to accumulate and coalesce into a form of power. The very divinity that had been stolen from him by Kaz's betrayal was now being granted to him through an entirely different path. Slowly, across decades or centuries, Vecna's followers gave him the strength to reform. His incorporeal spirit, which had drifted across the multiverse as a disembodied consciousness, began to gather substance and cohesion. The worship of mortals fueled his recovery, each prayer adding another increment of power, each sacrifice binding another thread of divine energy to his essence. Eventually, impossibly, Vecna achieved what the ritual had failed to accomplish. Through the devotion of his cultists rather than through his own magical prowess, he gathered enough power to form again as a demigod on Oerth, the very world where his mortal life had begun so many ages before. He had been destroyed and had returned. He had lost everything and was beginning to reclaim it. The boy born to the untouchable caste, who had become a lich, who had built and lost an empire, had now achieved a form of divinity. But for Vecna, even godhood was not an ending, but merely another beginning. His ambitions had not been diminished by defeat and resurrection. If anything, they had grown more grandiose, more terrible, more divorced from any limitation or restraint. The multiverse itself would soon learn that Vecna's story was far from over. Section 3. The Occluded Empire and the Wars of Conquest. Vecna's reformation as a demigod did not occur overnight, nor did it happen in isolation from the political and magical landscape of Oerth, as his consciousness slowly coalesced from the scattered fragments of his destroyed form. As the worship of his cultists gradually accumulated into divine power, Vecna found himself in a universe that had moved on during his absence. The territories he had once ruled were now claimed by others. The knowledge he had hoarded had been lost or rediscovered by different hands. The fear that his name had once inspired had faded into legend and myth, yet this did not discourage the returning archlich. Rather, it presented him with an opportunity to rebuild, to refine his approach, to apply the hard lessons learned from his defeat at Ka's hands. The empire that Vecna had constructed before his fall became known to history as the Occluded Empire, though during its existence it bore various names depending on who spoke of it and when. Some texts refer to it as the Empire of the Whispered One, invoking one of Vecna's many titles. Others call it the Black Empire or the Undying Realm, names that reflected both its dark nature and the immortal status of its ruler. The term occluded itself carries multiple meanings that perfectly encapsulate the nature of Vecna's dominion. It suggests something hidden or concealed, appropriate for an empire ruled by one who would become the god of secrets. It also implies something blocked or obstructed, fitting for a realm where knowledge was jealously guarded and information was the most valuable currency. At its height, the Occluded Empire stretched across vast swathes of the Flannies, the great eastern continent of Oerth. The exact boundaries shifted over the centuries of Vecna's rule, as territories were conquered, lost, and reconquered. But at its maximum extent, the empire was truly continental in scope. It reached from Perrinland in the northwest, spread across the plains to encompass the extent of the barrens, and crossed the great inland sea known as the Nerdiv. In the south, Vecna's dominion extended as far as the Woolly Bay, giving him control over both inland and coastal regions. This was not merely a large kingdom, but a true empire that spanned diverse climates terrains, and peoples, all bound together by the iron will and terrible magic of their undead overlord. The Sheldummer Valley served as the heartland of this empire, the region where Vecna's power was most concentrated, and from which he directed his expanding conquests. Within this valley, near the area that would later become known as the Rushmores, Vecna established his seat of power. Here, he constructed his infamous Black Tower, a structure that became legendary for both its imposing architecture and the terrible secrets it contained. The tower rose like a dark finger pointing accusingly at the sky, visible for miles across the flat lands of the valley, a constant reminder to all who dwelt in the region of who ruled them and what fate awaited those who defied that rule. Beneath the Black Tower, Vecna excavated an even more significant structure. The dark cathedral was carved into the living rock below his fortress, a vast underground complex that served multiple purposes. This was where Vecna conducted his most sensitive magical research, where he stored the most dangerous artifacts and forbidden tomes he had collected, where he performed rituals too terrible to be witnessed even by his own followers. The cathedral also functioned as a throne room where Vecna received important visitors and pronounced judgments on those brought before him. But perhaps most significantly, it served as a symbol of Vecna's contempt for the divine order. While conventional cathedrals reach upward toward the heavens and the gods who dwell there, Vecna's cathedral delved downward into darkness, a physical manifestation of his rejection of the established cosmic hierarchy and his determination to forge his own path to divinity. The process by which Vecna built his empire was as methodical and calculated as everything else he undertook. He did not simply appear with his undead armies and demand submission. Instead, he employed sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation and social engineering that were centuries ahead of their time. When he returned to his homeland after achieving lichdom, he challenged the high chieftain of his people and killed him in single combat, establishing his right to rule by the traditions his people respected. This demonstrated a subtle understanding of how to claim legitimacy in the eyes of those he sought to dominate. From this initial base of power, Vecna expanded his influence through a strategy of manufactured conflict. He would identify neighboring tribes and deliberately pit them against one another, fomenting disputes and escalating tensions until open warfare erupted. Then, when both sides had weakened themselves through combat, Vecna would intervene, offering aid to first one side and then the other, playing both ends against the middle. Each tribe that accepted his assistance found themselves gradually drawn deeper into his web of influence, becoming dependent on his support, obligated by debts they could never fully repay. But Vecna did more than simply conquer these peoples. He taught them. He showed them the intoxicating allure of power, demonstrated how hatred could be channeled into strength, revealed the advantages that came from conquest and domination. In time, the tribes that Vecna absorbed into his empire ceased to be merely conquered subjects. They became believers in his philosophy, converts to his worldview, willing participants in his grand project of domination. This transformation of conquered peoples into true followers represented one of Vecna's most insidious achievements. He did not merely rule through fear and force, but created a culture that embraced his values and actively worked to perpetuate his vision. As the occluded empire expanded, Vecna gathered to himself a host of humanoid servants to supplement his undead armies. Orcs, goblins, ogres, and other creatures typically shunned by civilized societies found acceptance and purpose within Vecna's ranks. This was not born from any sense of compassion or tolerance on the lich's part, but from cold pragmatism. These humanoid races possessed capabilities that mindless undead lacked. They could think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, perform complex tasks that required judgment and creativity. By incorporating them into his forces, Vecna created a more versatile and effective military machine. The empire struck northward first, expanding into the Barrens, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that few nations sought to claim. But Vecna recognized value where others saw only wasteland. The Barrens offered strategic depth, resources that could be exploited, and populations that could be subjugated or recruited. More importantly, controlling this region gave Vecna's empire a buffer against potential enemies from the north, forcing any invading force to cross difficult terrain before they could strike at his heartland. As Vecna's power grew, so too did the opposition to his rule. The elven kingdoms of Oerth, ancient civilizations that had endured for millennia, recognized the existential threat that the lich represented. Elves possess lifespans measured in centuries, giving them a perspective on history and time that short-lived humans rarely achieve. They understood that Vecna was not a temporary problem that would resolve itself with the passage of a few decades. He was an immortal menace who would continue growing in power indefinitely unless stopped. The elven kingdoms therefore acted to restrain Vecna's expansion, positioning themselves as the primary obstacle to his total domination of the continent. Foremost among these elven realms was the kingdom of Galitholian, ruled by a warrior king of the same name who would become Vecna's most persistent adversary. Galitholian, the king, was renowned for his martial prowess, his tactical brilliance, and his unwavering commitment to opposing evil in all its forms. When reports reached him of Vecna's expanding empire and the atrocities being committed in its name, he could not stand idle. Galitholian raised a great host, gathering warriors from across his kingdom and from allied elven realms, and marched to suppress the lich before he could grow too powerful to defeat. The first major battle between Galitholian's elven forces and Vecna's armies ended in disaster for the elves. Despite their superior training, their magical support, and their righteous cause, the elven warriors were driven from the field. Vecna's combination of necromantic magic, his undead legions that felt no fear or pain, and his own terrible personal power proved too much for conventional military forces to overcome. The elves retreated, bloodied and demoralized, forced to reassess their strategy against an enemy who defied all their previous experience of warfare. Another elven kingdom, Selene, renowned for its beauty and magical sophistication, responded to Galitholian's call for aid. The mages and warriors of Selene marched to join the fight against Vecna, determined that together the elven kingdoms would succeed where Galitholian alone had failed. But Vecna had not survived for centuries by being caught unprepared. His network of spies and diviners informed him of Selene's approach, giving him time to prepare a response that would forever alter the geography of Oerth. In what stands as one of the most terrible acts of Vecna's long history of atrocities, the lich called upon Tharisdun for aid. Tharisdun was and is the chained god, a deity of utter madness and destruction, imprisoned by the other gods because his very existence threatened the continued survival of reality itself. How Vecna managed to contact this imprisoned entity, what bargain he struck, or what price he paid, remains unknown. But the result was undeniable. Vecna unleashed a burning of such intensity and scale that it transformed an entire region in a matter of hours. What had been fertile land, capable of supporting agriculture and civilization, was reduced to lifeless desert. The magical fire consumed everything in its path, leaving behind only sand and scorched rock. This devastated area became known as the Bright Desert, a name that carries bitter irony, referring not to cheerful sunshine, but to the terrible brightness of the magical conflagration that created it. The forces of Selene, caught in or near the affected region, suffered catastrophic losses. Those who survived retreated in complete disarray, no longer an effective fighting force. The creation of the Bright Desert served multiple purposes beyond simply defeating Selene's army. It demonstrated the scale of destruction Vecna could unleash when pressed, making other potential enemies reconsider whether opposing him was worth the risk. It established a massive barrier between different regions of the continent, reshaping trade routes and political relationships in ways that benefited Vecna's strategic position. And perhaps most significantly, it proved that Vecna was willing and able to permanently alter the world itself to achieve his goals, that no cost was too high, no consequence too severe, if it served his purposes. With Galitholian forced to retreat to his mountain strongholds, and Selene in full withdrawal, Vecna finally turned his attention back to the city that had haunted him for over 1,000 years. Fleeth still stood, a lingering reminder of his origins and his mother's execution. Though he had sworn vengeance long ago, and though he now possessed power beyond anything the city could resist, Vecna approached this conquest with particular care. This was not merely another city to be added to his empire. This was personal. The siege of Fleeth proceeded much as described earlier, with Vecna's forces surrounding the city and gradually breaking down its defenses. The clerics of Foltis mounted a desperate resistance, channeling their god's power in increasingly potent displays of divine magic. During one particularly intense battle, these clerics unleashed a great burst of light directly at Vecna. A focused beam of radiant energy specifically designed to destroy undead. The attack struck the lich primarily on his left side, and for a terrible moment, it seemed the servants of Foltis might succeed where armies had failed. Vecna was gravely injured by this divine assault, damaged to such an extent that he required rescue from the battlefield. One of his wizard generals, a Cambion named Asurarak, who would eventually achieve infamy in his own right, extracted his master from the combat and brought him to safety. This moment of vulnerability, when the great Vecna himself was nearly destroyed by the very priests whose predecessors had executed his mother, must have filled the lich with renewed hatred. It also marked his left side, particularly his hand and eye, with exposure to holy energy that may have contributed to their later separation from his body during the battle with Cass. Vecna eventually recovered from his injuries and returned to complete his conquest of Fleeth. The city's defenders, exhausted and demoralized after their greatest weapon had failed to destroy their enemy, could mount only token resistance. When the end became inevitable, certain officials of Fleeth approached Vecna under a flag of truce, seeking to negotiate terms for surrender. They offered him the entire city and all its wealth if he would spare the lives of the citizens. When Vecna rejected these terms, the officials offered their own lives, hoping that their sacrifice would satisfy his thirst for revenge. One of these officials, a man named Artau, was singled out by Vecna and turned over to Kaz for punishment. The vampire lieutenant spent an entire day torturing and murdering Artau and his family in front of the other officials, a display calculated to break their spirits and demonstrate the absolute futility of their position. Even this horrific spectacle did not satisfy Vecna's hatred. When Kaz had finished his work, when Artau and his entire family lay dead, the lich still demanded more. The morning after what the people of Fleeth called the Feast of Himmer, the remaining officials emerged from the city to once again entreat Vecna for mercy. They told him they were ready to surrender everything, to place themselves and all they possessed at his discretion, asking only that lives be spared. Vecna replied that he could not agree to such terms, nor indeed to any terms at all, and that he would see the heads of everyone in Fleeth stacked before him. Some of Vecna's own followers, the barons and generals who served him, advised their master to accept the city's surrender. They begged him to show mercy, to recognize that further slaughter served no practical purpose. But Vecna did not listen. That very day, he ordered his siege engines and war wizards into position outside the walls. The final assault lasted approximately 5 hours, a concentrated barrage of physical and magical destruction that broke through every defense the city possessed. According to some accounts, Vecna personally brought down the walls of Fleeth with a single wave of his hand, a demonstration of the terrifying power he had accumulated over his centuries of existence. What followed was the massacre described earlier, with every man, woman, and child in the city slaughtered, their heads severed and stacked before the surviving officials, with the heads of each official's family members placed prominently atop the piles. Vecna then granted these officials his mercy, giving them leave to depart, and even promising them his protection for the remainder of their natural lives. They would live, but only to carry the memory of their total failure, only to serve as living testaments to what happened to those who wronged Vecna. The fall of Fleeth did not mark the end of Vecna's wars, but rather a turning point. With his personal vengeance complete, the Lich could focus entirely on the larger strategic goal of continental domination. He recognized that the Elven kingdoms remained the primary obstacle to this goal, so long as the elves stood against him, providing rallying points for resistance and safe havens for refugees fleeing his empire. Vecna would never be truly secure in his conquests. In negative 1,547 years of the common year calendar, approximately 604 years into the Flan timeline, Vecna made a fateful decision. He would take the war directly to the Elven kingdoms, not merely defending against their incursions, but actively seeking to destroy them. This marked the beginning of what became known as the 400-Year War, a conflict of such duration and intensity that it would reshape the entire continent. The first Elven city fell relatively quickly, demonstrating that even the ancient defenses of the elves could not stand indefinitely against Vecna's might. But the elves, despite this initial setback, proved to be far more resilient opponents than any Vecna had previously faced. They possessed magic as sophisticated as his own, accumulated knowledge spanning millennia. And most critically, they were fighting not for conquest or glory, but for survival. Every elf understood that if Vecna won, their entire civilization would be eradicated. This gave them a determination and unity of purpose that made them extraordinarily dangerous adversaries. The war ground on for decades that stretched into centuries. Vecna systematically attacked the Elven cities in the Griff Mountains, reducing them one by one through siege, assault, and dark magic. The Elven kingdoms of Selene and Highfolk recovered from their earlier defeats, attempted repeatedly to send aid to Galitholion. But Vecna's strategic position and military strength prevented most of these relief efforts from succeeding. By negative 1,230 years of the Common Year, Vecna had destroyed all but 5 of the Elven cities in the mountains. Yet, even as victory seemed within reach, even as the Elven kingdoms teetered on the brink of extinction, they continued to resist. Galitholion, the warrior king who had opposed Vecna from the beginning, remained alive and defiant, still fighting after centuries of warfare. This unprecedented persistence began to concern even the seemingly unstoppable Lich. Most mortal leaders would have died of old age or been killed in battle long before, allowing Vecna to negotiate or intimidate their successors. But Galitholion endured, his name becoming synonymous with resistance to tyranny, his example inspiring others to continue the fight even when hope seemed lost. Finally, after hundreds of years of warfare, Vecna and Galitholion came face to face on the battlefield in what would be their final confrontation. This occurred sometime between negative 1169 and negative 1163 years of the Common Year. The two armies arrayed themselves behind their respective leaders, and Galitholion issued a challenge. He demanded single combat between himself and Vecna, warrior to warrior, with the outcome to decide the war. Vecna accepted the challenge. As he stepped forward to meet his ancient adversary, the lich revealed a weapon that few had seen before, a black sword forged of stars, a blade of such dark magnificence that its mere appearance inspired dread. When Galitholion saw this sword, elven legends say that he was afraid, perhaps for the first time in his long life of battle. He was right to fear, for it was on that day, facing Vecna and his terrible star-forged blade, that Galitholion's spirit died. The exact nature of what happened in that single combat remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that Vecna killed Galitholion outright, ending the Elven King's centuries-long resistance. Others propose something even more terrible, that Vecna broke Galitholion's will without killing his body, destroying the king's spirit while leaving him technically alive, transforming him from a symbol of hope into a hollow shell that served as a warning against further resistance. Regardless of the specific outcome, the result was the same. The heart went out of the elven resistance. Without Galitholion to lead and inspire them, the remaining elven kingdoms could not sustain their opposition. The city known as the City of Summer Stars, one of the last great elven strongholds, fell to Vecna's assault. The magical energies Vecna expended in destroying the city were so vast that they left him significantly weakened. Yet, even in this diminished state, even after 400 years of continuous warfare, Vecna had effectively achieved his goal. The elven kingdoms were shattered, their populations decimated, their cities destroyed. Of the 4 great elven realms, 3 had been utterly conquered and destroyed. Only Selene survived, and it did so by hiding itself from the world, withdrawing behind magical barriers that made it impossible for Vecna to locate or attack. With the elven resistance broken, Vecna's occluded empire reached its fullness, spanning the continent from coast to coast. The period from approximately negative 1,566 to negative 1,150 years of the Common Year represented the height of Vecna's temporal power. He ruled an empire larger than any before or since, commanded military forces, both living and undead, that numbered in the millions, possessed magical knowledge accumulated across millennia, and had demonstrated repeatedly that he could overcome any opposition, whether mortal or elven, whether military or divine. It was at this moment, when he stood at the absolute pinnacle of worldly achievement, that Vecna's ambitions turned toward godhood. He had conquered the world. What remained but to transcend it entirely? The ritual he began to prepare, the great working that would sacrifice his entire empire to fuel his transformation into a god, represented the logical culmination of everything he had achieved, from untouchable child to lich to emperor to god. This was the trajectory Vecna had followed since his mother's execution over 2,000 years before. But at the very moment of his greatest triumph, when the ritual reached its climax and divine power began to flow into him, cause struck, the betrayal by his most trusted lieutenant, the battle that destroyed both of them and shattered the occluded empire, brought Vecna's first attempt at godhood to a catastrophic end. The Dark Tower crumbled into dust. The empire collapsed. Of Vecna, only his hand and eye remained as independent artifacts. The body of Kaz was never found, leading to speculation that the vampire had also somehow survived the destruction, though in what form and to what destination remained mysteries. 7 years after the great battle, pale-faced heads on stakes still stretched from the northwest terminus of the Sheldammer to the waters of the Lord, announcing a dominion that no longer existed. These grim markers, erected during the height of Vecna's power to warn travelers and mark his territory, remained in place long after their purpose had evaporated. They served as monuments to an empire that had risen higher and fallen harder than perhaps any in history, ruled by a being whose ambitions had finally exceeded even his extraordinary capabilities. Yet, even in defeat, even scattered and broken, Vecna's influence persisted. His name lived on in legend and nightmare. His artifacts circulated through the world, corrupting those who sought their power. His cultists continued to worship him in secret, gathering in shadowed places to perform rituals in his name. And somewhere, somehow, the consciousness of Vecna endured, waiting with the infinite patience of the immortal for the day when he could return and reclaim what had been taken from him. Section 4. Vecna's Ascension, the Demiplane of Dread, and the War for Divinity. Once believed to be finally destroyed, Vecna did not linger long in oblivion. The tremendous willpower, malice, and accumulated dark magic that defined his existence proved too powerful for even his legendary betrayers, or the gods themselves, to erase completely. Fragments of his being, held together by the legend of his name and the devotion of a growing cult, coalesced into a monstrous new form. Vecna the demigod, keeper of secrets, whispered one, and the maimed lord. This new state gave rise to some of the most influential and catastrophic events the multiverse would ever witness, as Vecna's ambitions, now unleashed from mortal constraints, strived toward full godhood and threatened the very structure of reality. During this period, cults across Oerth and beyond flourished, each lured by the promise of forbidden knowledge and unimaginable power. Vecna's artifacts, namely his left hand and eye, frequently resurfaced as dark relics that bestowed power and corruption in equal measure, often bending their wielders into new avatars of Vecna's will. Worship of Vecna emphasized silence, secrecy, and the uncovering of truth for control and personal might. Whispered rituals, encoded symbols, and treacherous bargains characterized this network of secrets that grew to span planes themselves. His cult's reach extended into cities long untouched by empire, burrowing into places like Greyhawk, Diamond Lake, and beyond. In these cults, death was a transition, perhaps a gift, when used to further Vecna's designs. His holy symbol, an open left hand with an eye in the palm, appeared in carved rock or blood-streaked sacrificial altars wherever knowledge festered and was hidden. After centuries as a being of immense arcane power, Vecna finally achieved apotheosis, becoming the demigod of secrets, undeath, and the arcane. The precise mechanism of his ascension is sometimes contradictory in the ancient records, but most agree his transformation resulted from the worship of desperate mortals, complex rituals, some say fueled by citywide or even empire-wide sacrifice, and an unyielding hatred that anchored his soul beyond reach of true destruction. Even in divinity, his body remained maimed, always missing the infamous hand and eye, separated from him during Ka's betrayal. The absence of these body parts became not a weakness, but a symbol of his endurance, a reminder that even dismemberment could not stop his inexorable rise. As a demigod, Vecna began to orchestrate plots on both mortal and divine stages. His first open move was to try to absorb the domain of time by challenging Pellar, seeking to extend the stasis of undeath over the boundaries of existence itself. The gods of Greyhawk moved against him, but Vecna, true to his title, lived between worlds, always one step ahead, always veiled in secrecy and misdirection. He manipulated events from the shadows, pulling strings that spanned continents and planes, orchestrating circumstances that would gradually accumulate into greater power for himself. Vecna's machinations brought him to the attention of other deities and planar forces. In his eternal quest to control and remake Oerth, Vecna grew powerful enough to threaten the very order of the gods. During one of his boldest attempts at ascension, in the legendary events later chronicled in tales told by adventurers and scholars, his cult plotted to grant him the status of a greater god by using ancient rituals in the heart of Greyhawk itself. The Circle of Eight, a powerful wizardly cabal including legendary figures such as Mordenkainen and the Archmage Bigby, attempted to stop Vecna's rise. These were not ordinary mages, but some of the most powerful arcane practitioners in all of Oerth, wizards who had faced down demon lords and elder evils, yet even they proved insufficient against Vecna's accumulated power and cunning. Vecna succeeded in slaying most of the Circle of Eight, scattering their bodies across Greyhawk and causing chaos that rippled through the entire region. The city descended into panic as word spread that the legendary protectors had fallen, that the Whispered One had returned with power enough to destroy those who had been thought invincible. Only the intervention of a handful of survivors and heroes of Greyhawk, aided by powers and circumstances that remain debated to this day, managed to contain his rise and prevent him from achieving full godhood in that moment. When he was eventually defeated in Greyhawk, Vecna found himself not in death, but exiled to Ravenloft, the demiplane of dread. This was not a mercy, but perhaps a more terrible fate than simple destruction. Ravenloft is a prison of nightmares, a realm that exists outside the normal flow of the multiverse, a place where the dark powers imprison beings too dangerous or too corrupt to exist in the material planes. Within Ravenloft, Vecna became the Dark Lord of Cavicius, an ashen, dread-filled realm constructed from his obsessions, his fears, and his unending hunger for knowledge and control. Cavicius reflected everything Vecna had become across his millennia of existence. It was a dead city, populated by undead servants, and built from the architecture of despair. Towers of blackened stone rose toward an eternally gray sky, their windows dark and their halls echoing with whispers of forbidden secrets. The very air of Cavicius carried the weight of ancient malice, pressing down on any living being foolish enough to enter the domain. Here Vecna ruled as absolute master, yet he was also prisoner, bound by the mysterious dark powers that controlled Ravenloft and prevented the Dark Lords from ever truly escaping. Ravenloft is infamous as the prison of powerful tyrants and monsters too dangerous to roam the multiverse freely. Each Dark Lord is trapped in a domain shaped by their crimes and obsessions, tormented by an ironic punishment that gives them everything they thought they wanted, while denying them the one thing they truly desire. For Vecna, this meant ruling over a realm of secrets, surrounded by knowledge and power, yet unable to break free and pursue his ultimate goal of remaking the multiverse itself. It was a torture specifically designed for one who valued control and knowledge above all else. To be trapped in a place where he had both, yet could do nothing with them beyond the borders of his domain. While in Cavicius, Vecna did not simply accept his imprisonment. He learned the forbidden secrets of Ravenloft itself, discovering truths about the demiplane of dread that other Dark Lords had never uncovered. Through his link with Moxlick, the serpent, the entity that may have been his original teacher in the dark arts, Vecna discovered the 3 words of creation, fundamental sounds that underlay the structure of reality itself. These insights and his tenacity propelled plots to break barriers between worlds and call forth incarnations of his followers from beyond Ravenloft's mists. Vecna was not the only power in Ravenloft. His ancient adversary Kaz, transformed by his own dark bargains, and the curse of the sword into a vampiric Dark Lord, ruled the neighboring domain of Tavag. The proximity of their domains was no accident. The dark powers, in their inscrutable wisdom or cruelty, had placed the two eternal enemies side by side, ensuring that their conflict would continue throughout eternity. Vecna and Kaz clashed endlessly across the borders of their domains, their feud fueling endless death, horror, and the expansion of their mythologies. Each saw in the other a reminder of past glories and ultimate betrayal, and neither could rest while the other existed. The wars between Cavicius and Taveg became legendary even within Ravenloft, a realm not known for shortage of horrors. Undead armies marched against vampiric legions. Necromantic magic collided with blood sorcery, and the two Dark Lords themselves occasionally met in personal combat. Battles that shook the foundations of both domains without ever producing a decisive victor. The dark powers ensured that neither could truly destroy the other, maintaining the eternal stalemate that was part of their punishment. Yet, for all the power Vecna accumulated in Cavicius, for all the secrets he uncovered and the schemes he orchestrated, he remained fundamentally trapped. The borders of his domain were absolute, the mists of Ravenloft impenetrable to his magic. Decades passed, then centuries, with Vecna growing ever more desperate to escape, ever more willing to pay any price for freedom. His opportunity came through Eos, ruler of a vast northern empire on Oerth, and demigod in his own right. Eos was powerful, ambitious, and arrogant, qualities that Vecna recognized and exploited. Through manipulation and carefully laid traps, Vecna managed to lure Eos into Ravenloft. Once the younger demigod crossed into the demiplane of dread, he found himself subject to its laws and unable to escape. Vecna, who had spent centuries studying Ravenloft's mysteries, held every advantage in this confrontation. What followed was not a fair battle, but a systematic draining of Eos's divine essence. By absorbing Eos's power, Vecna became a greater god. The absorption of another deity's divine energy provided enough raw power for Vecna to accomplish what he had failed to achieve through the ritual interrupted by Kaz so long ago. More critically, this surge of divine power allowed Vecna to shatter the bonds of the demiplane of dread itself. The mists that had held him for centuries parted before his will, the dark powers either unable or unwilling to prevent his escape. Vecna stepped out of Ravenloft and back into the wider multiverse, now wielding power that threatened to destabilize reality itself. His new status as a greater god allowed Vecna to pierce divine and cosmic boundaries that had previously been beyond even his considerable reach. He could walk between planes as easily as mortals walk between rooms, could manipulate the fundamental forces of magic and reality, could challenge other deities on equal footing. Yet, even this was not enough for Vecna. His ambitions had never been limited to simply becoming one god among many. He sought to become the supreme power, to remake the multiverse according to his vision, to ensure that every secret, every piece of knowledge, every truth in all of existence would flow through him. The peak of these ambitions occurred in events that became legendary across all planes and timelines. Vecna broke into Sigil, the city of doors, the metaphysical hub of all realms, and the theoretical heart of the multiverse. Sigil exists at the center of the Outlands, connected to every plane of existence through countless portals, ruled by the enigmatic and all-powerful Lady of Pain. No god had ever successfully entered Sigil, for the Lady of Pain forbids divine presence in her city. Yet Vecna, through methods that remain unclear, managed to breach these fundamental laws. Once inside Sigil, Vecna began the process of rewriting reality itself. He sought to alter the fundamental structure of the multiverse, to remake the planes according to his design, to establish himself as the supreme deity from whom all other gods would derive their power. Had he succeeded, the entire cosmology of existence would have been transformed, with Vecna standing at the apex of all creation. Every secret would have been his to know, every spell his to control, every soul his to command. The threat was so severe that it united forces that had never before cooperated. Gods who were ancient enemies put aside their feuds. Mortal heroes from a dozen different worlds gathered in Sigil, and planar entities of law and chaos alike recognized that Vecna's success would end everything they knew. The battle that followed was apocalyptic in scale, shaking Sigil to its foundations and threatening to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. At the critical moment, when it seemed Vecna might actually succeed in his cosmic coup, the Lady of Pain herself intervened. This enigmatic being, whose power exceeds that of gods and whose motives remain forever inscrutable, acted to preserve the integrity of her city and the multiverse beyond. With a gesture, she cast Vecna out of Sigil, breaking his hold on the cosmic forces he had begun to manipulate. The Whispered One was hurled back to Oerth, greatly diminished in power, reduced from greater god to lesser deity. Yet, even this catastrophic defeat did not end Vecna's story. So great was his myth, so deep was his influence, so powerful was the worship he had accumulated across millennia, that even his expulsion from Sigil and reduction in divine status could not erase him from existence. He endured as he always had, refusing to accept defeat, already beginning to plot his next move. Now existing as a lesser deity throughout Oerth, the Forgotten Realms, and beyond, Vecna's influence endures wherever knowledge is hidden, power is hoarded, or secrets are kept. His domains span magic, undeath, the occult, secrets, and forbidden lore. He is invoked by necromancers seeking to transcend death, by spies gathering information in service to kingdoms, by scholars of the arcane pursuing knowledge too dangerous for conventional study, by thieves who trade in secrets rather than gold, and by all who seek power through cunning or the manipulation of hidden truths. The mere presence of a rumor, a conspiracy, or a lost truth gives fuel to Vecna's divinity. Every time a secret is kept, every time knowledge is suppressed or hidden away, every time someone chooses concealment over revelation, they unknowingly strengthen the god of secrets. In this way, Vecna's power is perhaps more pervasive and inescapable than any other deity. For secrets exist everywhere, in every culture, in every individual heart. Temples to Vecna exist in the shadows and ruins of Oerth and countless other worlds. Unlike the grand cathedrals erected to gods of light and order, Vecna's places of worship are hidden, concealed in forgotten catacombs, abandoned towers, and the dark spaces beneath cities where few dare to venture. His cultists, ranging from power-hungry wizards to priests devoted to the philosophy of silence, continue his legacy through acts of manipulation and the weaponization of secrets. They gather in cells, often unaware of other followers in the same city, operating independently, yet all serving the same dark purpose. New generations continue to rediscover the hand and eye of Vecna, falling into their seductive embrace and spreading his legend further with each passing age. These artifacts appear and disappear throughout history, sometimes lying dormant for centuries before surfacing again, always finding their way to individuals whose ambition or desperation makes them vulnerable to corruption. Some seek victory through their power, others pursue forbidden knowledge. But all who touch Vecna's relics are ultimately drawn into his web, often at the cost of their souls, their sanity, or their very identity. The process of grafting these artifacts is itself a ritual of dark significance. To claim the hand of Vecna, one must first sever their own left hand, creating a wound that can never truly heal. The artifact then fuses to the stump, becoming part of the bearer's body, granting tremendous magical power, but also establishing a permanent connection to Vecna himself. The eye requires the removal of one's own left eye, a sacrifice of sight that paradoxically grants vision beyond normal perception, the ability to see through illusions, to perceive the invisible, to gaze across vast distances, and even between planes. Yet these gifts come with a terrible price, for the artifacts slowly corrupt their bearers, bending their will toward Vecna's purposes, transforming them into extensions of the gods' own consciousness. Vecna's power as a god is intimately tied to the mysteries of the world. The more that remains unknown, the stronger his shadow grows. In many ways, he is less a conventional deity than a primordial force of secrecy, ever present wherever mortals choose to hide the truth or seek that which should be left undisturbed. He does not demand worship in the traditional sense, does not require temples or priests or daily prayers. Instead, every act of concealment, every hidden truth, every piece of knowledge locked away from the world, these things themselves are offerings to Vecna, strengthening him whether the one keeping the secret even knows his name or not. Despite numerous defeats across the ages, despite being destroyed, imprisoned, diminished, and cast down repeatedly, Vecna reflects the eternal cycle of secrecy, ambition, destruction, and resurrection. He is a symbol not simply of evil in the abstract, but of the relentless pursuit of knowledge regardless of cost, of the desire for power that transcends all moral boundaries, of the refusal to accept any limitation on one's will or ambition. In each age, in every setting across the multiverse, the master of all that is secret and hidden returns in some form, walking again in shadow, working his subtle plots and leaving mortals to struggle with the cost of what they choose to learn or conceal. His influence extends even to those who oppose him, for in studying Vecna to understand how to defeat him, scholars and heroes inevitably uncover secrets that were perhaps better left unknown. In fighting against his cults, inquisitors and paladins must employ methods of secrecy and deception, gradually taking on the very qualities they claim to oppose. Vecna's true power lies not merely in his magic or his undeath, but in this fundamental truth that secrets are inevitable, that knowledge will always be sought, that power will always tempt those who encounter it. As long as these things remain true, as long as mortals possess curiosity and ambition, Vecna will endure. Section 5. The Hand and Eye of Vecna, the artifacts of eternal corruption. The most enduring legacy of Vecna's physical destruction, more lasting even than the ruins of his empire or the legends of his cruelty, are the two artifacts that bear his name and carry fragments of his essence across the ages. The Hand of Vecna and the Eye of Vecna are not merely magical items, but living extensions of the Archlich himself, pieces of his body that retain consciousness, power, and malevolent purpose long after being severed from their original form. These artifacts have appeared and reappeared throughout history, crossing between worlds and planes, always finding their way to individuals whose ambition, desperation, or hubris makes them vulnerable to the promises whispered by these remnants of a god. The origins of these artifacts lie in the climactic battle between Vecna and Kaz, that moment of ultimate betrayal when the vampire lieutenant turned the sentient sword against his master. During the ferocious combat that followed, as magic and martial prowess clashed with apocalyptic intensity, Kaz's blade struck true, severing Vecna's left hand and left eye from his body. The interruption of Vecna's ascension ritual, combined with the tremendous magical energies unleashed in that moment, imbued these severed body parts with power far beyond what even enchanted relics typically possess. They became thinking things, aware and purposeful, carrying within them a fragment of Vecna's consciousness and an undying connection to their creator. When the dust settled and the empire had fallen, when both Vecna and Kaz had seemingly been destroyed in the cataclysm they unleashed, the hand and eye remained. They were discovered in the ruins, appearing as withered, mummified remnants of an undead being. The hand gnarled and skeletal, with yellowed fingernails curved like claws. The eye, a shriveled orb, still containing a spark of terrible awareness. Those who found them recognized immediately that these were objects of immense power, though few understood the true cost of claiming that power for themselves. The process of attuning to these artifacts is not a simple matter of touching them or speaking a command word. To claim the hand of Vecna, one must first sever their own left hand, creating a permanent wound that marks the bearer forever. The artifact then grafts itself to the stump, fusing with living or undead flesh through means that transcend conventional healing or regeneration magic. The sensation of this fusion, by all accounts, is excruciating beyond description. As the withered hand becomes part of the bearer's body, its dead tissues somehow integrating with their circulatory system, its ancient bones aligning with the severed radius and ulna. Yet those who survive the process gain abilities that seem worth any price. The hand of Vecna grants its bearer strength beyond mortal limits, the ability to cast powerful spells without components or gestures, and most terrifyingly, the power to inflict cold death with a touch. Enemies struck by the hand find their life force drained away, their bodies withering as the artifact feeds upon their essence. The hand also provides protection, surrounding its bearer with defensive magic and allowing them to sense danger before it strikes. For a wizard or sorcerer, these abilities represent a tremendous amplification of their existing power. For a warrior or rogue, the hand offers magical capabilities they could never otherwise access. But the hand does not serve its bearer selflessly. It carries Vecna's will within it, subtly influencing the thoughts and actions of whoever grafts it to their body. At first, these influences seem minor, small suggestions that align with the bearer's existing goals and desires. The hand might encourage the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, or suggest that a rival would be better eliminated than converted, or whisper that mercy is weakness and power is all that matters. Over time, however, these whispers grow stronger and more insistent. The bearer begins to adopt Vecna's worldview, his obsession with secrets, his contempt for weakness, his willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve greater power. Eventually, if the bearer keeps the hand long enough, their personality becomes indistinguishable from Vecna's own. They become, in effect, an avatar of the Whispered One, their original identity subsumed beneath the weight of the Archlich's consciousness, preserved within the artifact. Some scholars believe that Vecna can see through his hand, experiencing everything its bearer experiences, gathering information and secrets from across the multiverse through these unwitting agents. Others suggest something even more sinister, that each person who grafts the hand becomes a potential vessel for Vecna's full return, a body waiting to be claimed should the Archlich ever need to manifest in physical form once more. The Eye of Vecna functions through similar principles, but offers different powers. To claim it, one must first remove their own left eye, an act of self-mutilation that demonstrates the bearer's commitment to obtaining power regardless of cost. The artifact then settles into the empty socket, its shriveled form somehow filling the space, its ancient tissues connecting to the bearer's optic nerve through means that defy anatomical logic. Like the hand, the process of integration is agonizing. But those who survive find themselves possessed of sight beyond anything their natural eye could provide. The eye of Vecna grants true seeing, the ability to perceive through all illusions and see things as they truly are. Invisible creatures become visible to the bearer. Shapeshifters appear in their true form. Magical disguises fail completely. The eye can see in complete darkness, pierce through walls and barriers, and perceive across vast distances. Most significantly, it allows the bearer to read thoughts and discern truths, seeing through lies and deceptions with ease. For a spy, a sage, or anyone who deals in information and secrets, the eye represents the ultimate tool. Yet, like the hand, the eye exerts its own corrupting influence. It shows the bearer truths they may not wish to see, revelations that erode their faith in friends and allies. It whispers constantly about secrets that must be uncovered, knowledge that must be obtained, information that must be controlled. The bearer becomes paranoid, seeing conspiracies and betrayals everywhere, trusting no one, hoarding what they learn like a dragon hoards gold. They become obsessed with vision and revelation, spending hours staring at people and places, unable to look away from the truths the eye reveals. The true horror of these artifacts, however, becomes apparent when someone possesses both simultaneously. On rare occasions throughout history, individuals have managed to acquire both the hand and the eye, grafting them to their body in pursuit of ultimate power. When this occurs, the two artifacts resonate with each other, their connection to Vecna creating a synergy far more potent than the sum of their individual abilities. The bearer gains access to spells and powers that even Vecna possessed in his prime, wielding magic that can reshape reality, command the dead, and pierce the barriers between planes. But possessing both artifacts also accelerates the bearer's transformation into Vecna's vessel. The two pieces of the arch-lich, reunited even though separated from the rest of his form, work together to overwrite the bearer's personality completely. Within days, or at most weeks, the original person ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. What remains is Vecna, or something so close to him that the distinction becomes irrelevant. The bearer's body becomes a puppet, animated by the will preserved in the artifacts, speaking with Vecna's voice and pursuing Vecna's goals. Throughout the ages, these artifacts have left a trail of corruption and destruction. They have appeared in the treasure hoards of dragons, been discovered in ancient tombs, surfaced in the collections of powerful wizards, and found their way into the hands of those who should never have touched them. Some bearers use the power wisely at first, employing the artifacts to defend their kingdoms or advance worthy causes. But the corruption is inevitable, and eventually every bearer turns toward darkness, becoming a threat that must be stopped by heroes or rival powers. Attempts to destroy the hand and eye have universally failed. They have been thrown into volcanoes, submerged in holy water, subjected to powerful disenchantment magic, and exposed to divine wrath. Yet they endure, somehow surviving every attempt at their destruction. At most, they can be sealed away, hidden in places warded with powerful magic, guarded by oath-bound orders of paladins, or imprisoned in extra-dimensional spaces. But seals weaken over time, guardians die or are corrupted, and the artifacts always, eventually, find their way back into circulation. Some believe the artifacts cannot be destroyed because they are part of a god, and gods exist beyond the reach of conventional magic. Others suggest that Vecna himself protects them from afar, using his divine power to preserve these anchors of his consciousness in the material world. A few scholars propose an even more disturbing possibility: that the artifacts don't want to be destroyed, that the fragment of Vecna's consciousness they contain gives them a form of will and agency, allowing them to subtly manipulate events to ensure their own survival. The hand and eye also serve a strategic purpose for Vecna beyond simply spreading his influence. Every person who grafts these artifacts, every bearer who falls under their corrupting sway, becomes a source of information for the God of Secrets. Through them, Vecna learns what is happening across the multiverse, discovering plots and schemes, uncovering hidden knowledge, gathering intelligence that informs his own divine plans. The artifacts function as his eyes and ears, literally and figuratively, scattered across worlds and planes, ensuring that even when Vecna himself cannot manifest or act, he remains aware and informed. Cults dedicated to Vecna actively seek out these artifacts, viewing their recovery as a sacred duty. When rumors surface that the hand or eye has appeared somewhere, cultists mobilize, traveling great distances and overcoming tremendous obstacles to claim the relic for their god. Some cultists hope to use the artifacts themselves, believing they are strong enough to resist the corruption or viewing transformation into Vecna's vessel as the highest honor imaginable. Others seek the artifacts to present them to their cult leaders or to install them in temples, creating focal points for worship and centers of dark power. The presence of the hand or eye in a region inevitably attracts attention from multiple factions. Adventurers and heroes seek to secure the artifacts and prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. Rival cults and evil organizations attempt to claim them for their own purposes. Collectors and scholars try to obtain them for study, often fatally underestimating the danger. And Vecna's own followers work to ensure the artifacts serve their master's purposes, eliminating anyone who interferes. The result is often a localized conflict, a convergence of competing interests that can destabilize entire regions. Stories are told of legendary heroes who bore the hand or eye for a time, using their power to achieve great deeds before the corruption took hold. These individuals are remembered as tragic figures, heroes who sacrificed too much in pursuit of victory, who paid the ultimate price of losing themselves to the very evil they fought against. Their tales serve as warnings about the seductive nature of power and the danger of believing oneself immune to corruption. Yet, despite these warnings, despite the long history of tragedy associated with the artifacts, each new generation produces individuals willing to take the risk. They convince themselves that they will be different, that they are strong enough to resist where others failed, that they can control the power rather than being controlled by it. And perhaps a few genuinely believe that the sacrifice of their identity is worthwhile if it allows them to accomplish some greater good. Though such rationalizations typically prove to be the first step down the path of corruption. The hand and eye of Vecna exist as constant reminders of the archlich's enduring influence, even without his empire, even reduced to the status of a lesser god, even imprisoned or defeated repeatedly. Vecna remains a presence in the world through these artifacts. They ensure that his legend never dies, that his name continues to be spoken, that his power touches new lives in every age. They are his legacy, his curse upon the world, fragments of a being too powerful and too willful to ever be truly destroyed. And somewhere, whether in a divine realm beyond mortal understanding or in the hidden spaces between planes, Vecna watches through his scattered pieces, waiting patiently for the next ambitious soul to graft his hand to their wrist or press his eye into their socket. Each new bearer represents another opportunity, another potential vessel, another step in whatever grand design the God of secrets has planned. The hand and eye continue their endless journey through history, moving from bearer to bearer, leaving corruption and destruction in their wake, always serving purposes that only Vecna himself fully understands. For those who study the artifacts, who track their movements through history and catalog the fates of those who bore them, one truth becomes inescapable. The hand and eye are not prizes to be won or tools to be used. They are traps, temptations, lures that promise power, while delivering only corruption and transformation into vessels for an ancient evil. Yet knowing this truth has never been enough to prevent the next ambitious individual from seeking them out, from believing that they will be the exception, from taking that fatal step of grafting dead flesh to their living body. And so the cycle continues, age after age, world after world, ensuring that Vecna's influence spreads ever outward through the multiverse, one corrupted soul at a time. Section 6, Cavicious, the domain of dread, and the endless war with cause. The demiplane of dread is a prison unlike any other in all the multiverse, a realm of nightmares given substance and form, where the most terrible beings in existence find themselves trapped within domains shaped by their own evil. Each domain reflects the sins and obsessions of its Dark Lord, creating a perfect torment that grants them everything they believe they desire, while denying them the one thing they truly need. When Vecna's avatar manifested upon Oerth, following his long period of recovery and reformation, the dark powers that control Ravenloft recognized an opportunity. They seized upon the connection his manifestation created to the material plane, using it as a conduit to reach out. and capture one of the most powerful beings ever to exist. Vecna found himself bound to a domain called Cavicius, named after his old citadel on the quasi-elemental plane of Ash, a place he had visited or perhaps created during his explorations of the outer planes. This domain was constructed from his obsessions and his nature, reflecting everything he had become across his millennia of existence. Cavicius manifested as a vast desert of gray ash and dust, stretching endlessly under a sky the color of old bone. The sand itself was hostile to life, sapping the vitality of any living being who set foot upon it, slowly draining their strength and will until they collapsed and became part of the lifeless waste. At the center of this desolate expanse rose Citadel Cavicius, the only settlement in the entire domain, a city that served as Vecna's seat of power and the focal point of his dark rule. The citadel was a massive structure of black stone and iron, its architecture deliberately imposing and threatening, designed to inspire dread in any who approached. Towers rose like skeletal fingers clawing at the gray sky, their windows dark and empty, their battlements lined with the shapes of gargoyles and worse things. The walls of the citadel stretched for miles, encompassing a city-sized interior where the peculiar society of Cavicius carried out its existence. Some accounts describe the entire structure as being built within or around a massive skull, as though the city itself were housed within the head of some ancient giant or primordial being. A fitting home for one who valued knowledge and secrets above all else. Within Citadel Cavicius, the undead were the leading citizens, the privileged class who moved through the streets with authority and purpose. Skeletons in rusted armor patrolled the walls and maintained order. Zombies performed manual labor in workshops and construction sites. Wights and wraiths served as administrators and enforcers, and liches pursued research in laboratories and libraries. These undead inhabitants did not shamble mindlessly as undead typically do, but rather possessed a disturbing semblance of normal life, going about daily routines, engaging in commerce, even holding conversations and debates. They were the memories of Vecna, fragments of knowledge and personality extracted from those who had served him in life and preserved in undeath to continue their service eternally. The living residents of Cavicius, by contrast, had no rights whatsoever. They existed as a lower caste, servants and slaves to the undead majority, their lives utterly controlled by those who no longer possessed life themselves. These unfortunate mortals had been drawn to Cavicius through various means. Some had wandered through the mists of Ravenloft and found themselves trapped. Others had been brought as prisoners or sacrifices. Still, others had been born within the domain to parents who were themselves prisoners. They lived in the lower levels of the citadel, in cramped quarters carved from the foundations, surviving on scraps and performing whatever labor the undead masters demanded. The living were largely ignored by the undead ruling class, as long as they did not interfere with the affairs of their betters. Life had no value in Cavicius, and any living being who dared to interfere with an undead creature would find themselves hunted by the Reavers, skeletal knights, who served as enforcers of the domain's twisted order. Yet, even among this oppressed population, Vecna's influence manifested in twisted ways. Some of the living residents had come to worship their undead lord, viewing Vecna as a god worthy of veneration, a savior who protected them from the even worse fate that awaited in the neighboring domain of Taveg. These faithful gathered in the temple of Vecna, a grand structure within the citadel where priests who called themselves memories of Vecna delivered sermons about the glory of secrets, the power of forbidden knowledge, and the inevitable triumph of their master over all who opposed him. Magic was forbidden to all except within the walls of this temple, where it functioned freely, a demonstration of Vecna's absolute control over the arcane forces within his domain. They saw their subjugation not as oppression, but as service to a higher purpose, their suffering not as punishment, but as a form of devotion that would be rewarded when Vecna finally achieved his ultimate goals. The geography of Cavicius extended beyond the citadel and its immediate surroundings. The ash desert that covered most of the domain was broken occasionally by formations of twisted black stone, the ruins of structures that had existed before the domain took its current form, or perhaps manifestations of Vecna's memories of places from his mortal life. Travelers who ventured into this desert faced not only the life-draining properties of the ash itself, but also the creatures that dwelt there, undead horrors adapted to the hostile environment, aberrations spawned from the fusion of dark magic and the peculiar nature of Ravenloft, and worse things still that defied easy categorization. Vecna had also created Citadel Cavicius as a prison for his defeated enemies, and within its walls languished approximately 1,000 beings who had opposed him during his mortal reign or after his ascension to godhood. Death offered no escape from this place, for those who died within Cavicius were simply raised as undead to continue their imprisonment in a new and more terrible form. Most significantly, Cavicius was constantly at war with the neighboring domain of Taveg, ruled by Kaz the Destroyer. The dark powers, in their inscrutable wisdom or malice, had placed these two eternal enemies in adjacent domains, ensuring that their hatred would fuel an endless conflict. A single road connected Cavicius to Taveg, cutting through the ash wastes and serving as the primary battlefield for the war between the two Dark Lords. Anyone who strayed from this road faced almost certain death, lost in the lifeless desert with no landmarks to guide them and no hope of rescue. The war itself was peculiar in nature, reflecting the artificial constraints imposed by Ravenloft. Neither side ever gained a lasting advantage, despite centuries of constant combat. Armies would clash along the road, undead legions from Cavicius meeting vampiric forces from Taveg in battles that left the ash stained with ichor and littered with broken bodies. Occasionally, one side would push forward, claiming a few miles of territory, only to be driven back days or weeks later when the opposing force rallied. The front lines shifted back and forth endlessly, but the overall strategic situation never changed. Vecna and Kaz themselves rarely participated directly in these battles, though their presence loomed over every clash. The troops fought as proxies for the mutual hatred their Dark Lords shared. Each soldier or undead warrior representing their master's desire to finally destroy their ancient enemy on rare occasions when the stakes seemed particularly high, or when one side appeared ready to achieve a significant breakthrough. The Dark Lords would take the field personally. These encounters between Vecna and Kaz were apocalyptic in scale. The Archlich's terrible magic colliding with the vampire's martial prowess, and the dark powers of the sentient sword he still wielded. Yet, even these personal combats never produced a decisive victor. The dark powers ensured that neither Dark Lord could permanently destroy the other, maintaining the stalemate that was part of their eternal punishment. Vecna would unleash spells that should have reduced Kaz to ash, only to have the vampire somehow survive or regenerate from injuries that would have killed any normal being. Kaz would strike with his cursed blade, cutting through Vecna's magical defenses and inflicting wounds that should have scattered the Archlich's essence, only to watch his enemy retreat and reform, ready to continue the war. This endless conflict served as a unique torment for both Dark Lords. For Vecna, who valued knowledge and secrets above all else, who had always relied on cunning and preparation to achieve his goals, the war represented a situation he could not solve through cleverness alone. No amount of planning or strategy could break the stalemate. No secret knowledge could provide the key to final victory. He was forced to engage in a direct, brutish conflict utterly at odds with his nature, expending resources and effort on a war that could never be won. For Kaz, the torment was equally profound. The vampire had betrayed Vecna to seize power for himself, yet now found himself in an even worse situation than when he had served the Archlich. He ruled a domain, yes, but it was a prison from which he could never escape. He commanded armies, but they fought an unwinnable war against an enemy he could never truly defeat. And most galling of all, he remained forever in Vecna's shadow, defined by his relationship to the master he had betrayed, unable to establish an identity or legacy independent of the lich he hated. Despite the constraints of his imprisonment, Vecna did not abandon his ambitions for escape and greater power. While his armies fought the endless war with Tavag, while his undead servants maintained the operations of Citadel Cavicius, Vecna himself pursued research into the nature of Ravenloft. He studied the mists that bounded his domain, analyzed the subtle rules that governed the demiplane of dread, and sought weaknesses in the prison that held him. His connection to Moxlick, the serpent, proved invaluable in this research. Through this link, Vecna learned secrets of creation itself, discovering the 3 words of creation fundamental sounds that predated language, that underlay the structure of reality, that possessed power beyond conventional magic. These discoveries gave Vecna hope that escape might be possible, but he understood that raw knowledge alone would not be sufficient. He needed power, vast amounts of divine energy, to fuel the working that would shatter his bonds and allow him to escape Ravenloft. During his time on Oerth, before his capture by the Dark Powers, Vecna had conceived of various paths to greater divinity. One of these involved the sacrifice of an existing deity, draining their divine essence and adding it to his own. Though he had been prevented from executing this plan on Oerth, the concept remained sound. Vecna began to lay a trap, constructing an elaborate lure that would draw another divine being to Cavicius. He created false rituals and scattered hints of their existence, descriptions of a working that would supposedly allow one deity to steal the power of another. These hints were carefully crafted to appear authentic, backed by just enough genuine magical theory to seem plausible to someone seeking such knowledge. Then Vecna waited with the infinite patience of the undead, knowing that eventually someone would discover his bait and take the hook. That someone was Eos, the demigod who ruled a vast empire in the north of Oerth, the Old One, the Lord of Pain and Deceit. Eos had his own ambitions toward greater godhood, his own desire to transcend his current status and achieve true divine supremacy. When he discovered what appeared to be a ritual that would allow him to drain Vecna's power and add it to his own, Eos saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The Archlich was trapped in Ravenloft, seemingly helpless, unable to escape or defend himself effectively. All Eos needed to do was invade Cavicius through a portal from Oerth, perform the ritual, and claim the tremendous power that would be his. Eos invaded Cavicius with confidence, born of ignorance and arrogance. He gathered his forces, powerful demons and mortal servants, and led them through the portal into Vecna's domain. The demigod expected resistance, anticipated that Vecna would defend himself, but believed that his own power combined with the element of surprise would carry the day. What Eos failed to understand was that everything had been planned, that every detail of the invasion had been anticipated and accounted for, that he was not the predator, but the prey. The ritual Eos attempted to perform did indeed allow one divine being to drain the power of another, but Vecna had designed it not to benefit the caster, but to benefit himself. As Eos began the working, confident in his impending victory, the spell reversed its flow. Instead of Vecna's power flowing into Eos, Eos's power began flowing into Vecna. The demigod realized his error too late, finding himself trapped within the ritual circle, unable to break free or disrupt the working. He could only watch in horror as his divine essence was systematically drained away, siphoned into the waiting vessel of his enemy. Vecna devoured Eos and his power, absorbing the demigod's divine energy and adding it to his own. The surge of power was tremendous, elevating Vecna from demigod to full deity, granting him capabilities and authority he had never possessed even at the height of his mortal empire. More critically, this influx of divine energy gave him the raw power needed to break free of the demiplane of dread. The bonds that the dark powers had placed upon him, the mystical barriers that had held him in Cavicius for centuries, shattered under the force of his newfound divinity. Vecna escaped from Ravenloft, stepping out of the prison that had held him and back into the wider multiverse, using his sudden upsurge in power and the esoteric knowledge from the serpent. Vecna not only unshackled himself from Ravenloft, but also used its planar structure to burrow into the heart of Sigil, the city of doors, with his avatar ensconced in Sigil, at the very center of the multiverse. Vecna prepared to reshape all of reality to his will, using the dimensional hole he had torn through the planes. The mists parted before him, the borders of his domain dissolving as he walked through them, emerging into a reality that had continued on during his imprisonment. Yet, Vecna's plans came to an end when adventurers, wielding lesser body parts taken from his mortal frame, destroyed his avatar in Sigil. Following Vecna's defeat, he was ejected back onto the material plane, defeated though still with a great deal of divine power remaining. Eos, who though absorbed had not been obliterated, escaped his captivity and returned to his empire on Oerth. What happened to Cavicius after Vecna's departure remains a matter of debate among scholars who study the demiplane of dread. Some sources suggest the domain survived, continuing to exist within Ravenloft, but without a Dark Lord to rule it. In this version, the citadel became an abandoned ruin, haunted by the undead memories Vecna left behind, their routines continuing mindlessly without their master to direct them. Others propose that portions of the domain were claimed by Kaz as an extension of Taveg, the vampire finally achieving victory over his ancient enemy's territory, though the victory came only after Vecna had already abandoned it. Still, other accounts describe a more dire fate for the domain. According to these tales, Cavicius began to crumble and dissolve after Vecna's escape, torn apart by the very forces he had unleashed in breaking free. The domain found itself caught between geographical forces, with volcanic eruptions on one side and a black hole created by Vecna's escape pulling from the other direction. Citadel Cavicius hung on the edge of oblivion, slowly being torn apart, with various factions rising among the abandoned inhabitants to struggle for control of what remained. Some of Vecna's former followers continued to worship him even in his absence, convinced he would return to claim his domain once more. Others, led by new powers drawn to the vacuum Vecna left behind, began to believe that gods could not be relied upon to save them, that they must take control of their own destiny. Regardless of which account holds the greater truth, Vecna himself never returned to Cavicius, having escaped the prison that the dark powers had created for him. Having broken free of the demiplane of dread through cunning and ruthless ambition, he had no intention of ever allowing himself to be trapped there again. The domain that had been shaped by his obsessions and his evil remained behind as a monument to his imprisonment, a testament to the dark power's ability to cage even the mightiest beings, and a warning of what awaited those who grew too powerful for the multiverse to contain. Yet, even in apparent defeat, even cast down from the heights he had briefly achieved in sigil, Vecna endured as he always had. He remained a lesser deity, still commanding the worship of cultists across countless worlds, still gathering secrets and forbidden knowledge, still plotting his next move with the infinite patience that had characterized his entire existence. The boy born to the untouchable caste, who became a lich, who built and lost an empire, who was imprisoned and escaped, who achieved godhood only to be cast down, this being refused to accept any limit on his ambition. And so, the legend of Vecna continues, carried forward by those who seek forbidden knowledge, by those who trade in secrets, by those who believe that power justifies any price, and that the ends always justify the means. His hand and eye still circulate through the multiverse, corrupting new bearers in every age. His cults still gather in shadowed places to perform dark rituals in his name. His influence still touches every secret kept, every truth hidden, every piece of knowledge locked away from the world. For as long as mortals possess curiosity and ambition, for as long as secrets exist to be discovered and knowledge exists to be pursued, Vecna will endure. He is more than a god now, more than a lich or an empire or a collection of artifacts. He has become an idea, a principle, a fundamental truth about the nature of power and knowledge that cannot be destroyed by any weapon or spell. The Whispered One remains, eternal and patient, waiting in the spaces between planes, gathering his strength, planning his return, knowing that time is on his side, and that eventually, inevitably, the multiverse will once again tremble at the name of Vecna, the master of all that is secret and hidden. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed diving deep into the secrets and shadows of Vecna's tale, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more legends to explore, and your support helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, may your secrets remain your own, and may you sleep well in the knowledge that some mysteries are best left undisturbed.